Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am thrilled to be joined by a returning guest, Patrick Novecosky. Welcome to the show.
So good to be back with you and in Ave Maria.
That's right, yes. And it's great, of course, not only to be a fellow traveler, but also to be a dad, right? You got to bring your kids to Ave.
Yeah, absolutely. My daughter's a sophomore here, and my son, Stephen, is 17. He's looking at fall of 26, enrolling in Ave Maria.
Wow. Well, we're so glad to have you here. And so for those who may not know, Patrick Novecosky is the director or the executive director of a crisis pregnancy center in Warrenton, Virginia. Also the founder and director of NovaMedia, and also, of course, a lot of very frequent author, speaker on John Paul II, and now Mother Teresa. You have a new book coming out on Mother Teresa and John Paul II, right? Two saints. So yeah, I was really looking forward to seeing that book come out.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
I was able to read a little bit of the of the PDF you sent, and I think it's just amazing to just think about how that these great saints, Mother Teresa, John Paul II, were friends.
Great friends.
Yeah, exactly. So, and you mentioned in your book that I think it was in 1986, Mother Teresa received in India and at the Missionaries of Charity received a visit from John Paul II, Pope John Paul II in 1986, and she called it the happiest day of her life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a fulfillment of joy for her. Her life's work, of course, caring for the sick and dying in Calcutta, that's where it all started. And to have the Vicar of Christ there, not only the Vicar of Christ, but her friend, the Vicar of Christ, brought her extraordinary joy. And it moved John Paul II to tears, and I've been pondering that because here's a man who grew up under communism. He was 19 years old when the tanks rolled into Poland, and he saw horrific things as a young man, as a young priest, as a young bishop confronting communism. So he saw a lot of degradation and pain. But when he walked into the room and saw these people who are dying, and actually he blessed, I think, 6 corpses that day, people who had recently passed away who were still in the home for the dying, it moved him to tears beyond what I think he even anticipated. And it gave him, too, a great heart for Mother Teresa. He actually committed himself to doing something tangible after that visit. And it took 2 years, but he, with the Missionaries of Charity, opened a shelter at the Vatican for homeless people in Rome. And I think that was one of his happiest days, because not only did he teach about human dignity and mercy, but now he was actually able to do something like she did and make something happen. And that shelter is still open and still active and still housing homeless men and women in Rome and feeding them every day. Wow.
That's amazing. And it's kind of, it's interesting because when they greeted one another, they were friends, even though they hadn't spent much time together.
Yeah.
They were, as you might put it, they were best friends with each other's best friends, and how did this develop?
Yeah, interesting to that. I find that when I meet fellow Catholics, I can make an instant friend. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. When you find someone who has a heart for the faith, a passion for the faith, who's living the faith, striving for holiness, and it's easy to communicate no matter where you are in the world, because you have a common language, you have a common bond in the church. And so I think when John Paul II and Mother Teresa met for the first time at an International Eucharistic Congress in Melbourne, Australia, and two biographers say that they met there, Cardinal Dziwisz and Tad, I cannot pronounce his last name, Polish last name, note that they met there. The Pope's diary doesn't include anything about their meeting. She was relatively famous at the time. She kind of rose to fame in the late 60s after an interview with the BBC. They met again at an International Eucharistic Congress, interestingly, here in the United States, in Philadelphia. And by that time, they had had some correspondence and knew each other better. But I think once he became Pope, they met more frequently. And they really had a brother-sister relationship. George Weigel said that when they met, they really didn't have many words, because I really feel like they were like-minded and had similar passions and desires for humanity, and they understood each other.
Yeah, you also mentioned in the book, you tell the story about how, I don't remember which visit it was, but one of the Pope's visits, she just runs up into the Pope-mobile.
Yes.
And you mentioned that she might have been the only woman to ride in the Pope-mobile with the Pope?
Yes. That was the January 1986 visit in Calcutta. Mm-hmm. She just climbed in, and he kissed her. She kissed his ring, and he kissed the top of her head. She kissed his ring, and they drove through the streets of Calcutta together.
Wow. So we have a probably about 20 feet by 20, I don't know.
Yeah.
20 feet by 30 foot mural on the side of one of our buildings of Mother Teresa and John Paul II. And we also have dorms that are right next to each other, John Paul II and Mother Teresa on campus. So they've been great inspirations as well for Ave Maria. So, I'd love for you to just, what is it about these particular saints that need to be remembered today, and that why you chose to partly dedicate your life to helping these saints be known, but also why you wrote this book to help another generation maybe get acquainted with Mother Teresa and John Paul II, but also to remind many who remember them.
Yeah, I grew up watching Mother Teresa, John Paul II on the world stage, and as I say it in the introduction to my book, God sends us the saints that we need for our times. John Paul II, Mother Teresa may not have been world famous or even famous at all in an earlier time, but God sent them and formed them to teach us something about himself, about holiness, about the pursuit of holiness, about how to understand God, in the modern day. And I wrote the book because there really is no other book like this. There's no book that kind of details their friendship, their collaboration, the ways in which their friendship, and the themes of their ministries, which I say are human dignity and mercy. One interesting story, and I went back to this because 3 weeks after Mother Teresa died, I interviewed her successor, Sister Normala, at the Sisters' Mother House in Rome, and she told me an interesting story. She said that the day after Mother's funeral, the Sisters, Missionaries of Charity, gathered at Mother's tomb and spontaneously started praying the Divine Mercy Chaplet. Now, Mother Teresa didn't know much about Sister Faustina. She didn't know much about the Divine Mercy devotion, but the sisters did this, and Sister Normala said Mother must have had a hand in it. She was very clear about that this was something from heaven for Mother Teresa. Now, I reached out to Mother Teresa's postulator to inquire if the sisters were still doing this. So, and he said, yes, they are. He connected with Calcutta. They confirmed that the sisters, although it's not a prescribed prayer, they voluntarily pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet at 3:00 every day and have been doing so since Mother Teresa's funeral. So it makes sense because Mother was all about mercy, about dignity and elevating and restoring human dignity. And she was called the Saint of Mercy. So it only makes sense that there would be some eternal, some divine connection with Faustina, her revelations in the 1930s about divine mercy and the time of mercy and the ocean of mercy that Jesus has for us, and this great saint.
Yeah. So, maybe for people who are not quite as familiar, kind of unpack a little bit of John Paul II's, his own recovery of mercy through Sister Faustina, but through his encyclical Divis Misericordia, you mentioned, God the Father, rich in mercy, quoting from Ephesians, but then also his institution of the Sunday after the Sunday of the octave of Easter,
right,
as Divine Mercy Sunday. So, what was the importance of mercy in John Paul II's life and
I'll
teaching?
start with Saint Faustina. So Sister Faustina Kowalska received apparitions from Jesus, revelations from Jesus during the 1930s. She died just after Karol Wojtyła moved to Krakow. She lived in just outside of Krakow in Łagiewnicki, Poland. And she wrote a diary of her spiritual experiences, according to her spiritual director asked her to. And Jesus asked two things of Faustina. One, to have an image painted according to what she saw, and that's the Divine Mercy image, and also to have the second Sunday of Easter declared Divine Mercy Sunday. Well, she could do something about the image, so she had a painter paint it, and she was dissatisfied. She said, Jesus, who can paint you as beautiful as you really are? But she wrote in her diary that Jesus, in a sense, commanded that the second Sunday of Easter be declared Divine Mercy Sunday. Well, then she died and the war happened, and there was this explosion of Divine Mercy devotion in Poland, according to her revelations. But because of the communist government, the Vatican was unable to verify her writings, her diary. Some bad translations got out. And so for 20 years, from 1958 to 1978, the Vatican said no more spreading Divine Mercy, according to Sister Faustina, anywhere. Well, John Paul II, early in his pontificate, said that Providence had assigned him this task to unpack Divine Mercy. So as Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, he opened St. Faustina's canonization cause. He assigned his top theologian to verify, authenticate her diary, which happened, interestingly, 6 months before he was elected Pope. The Vatican lifted the ban, and people were able, again, to print the Divine Mercy image and spread the devotion to Jesus through, according to St. Faustina's revelations. So John Paul had that experience of 20, 30 years of Sister Faustina, the diary, and kind of absorbing that. So his first encyclical was The Redeemer of Men, Redemptor Hominis.
Yes.
Second encyclical was, in a sense, a sequel to that, called Divas in Misericordia, Rich in Mercy, and where he says that God the Father is rich in mercy. And it's a beautiful read, and unpacking the heart of God for us, and really stems from, in a sense, his experience of divine mercy through Sister Faustina, then soon to be Saint Faustina. Now, you also asked about the second Sunday of Easter being declared Divine Mercy Sunday. There was a criticism of this Divine Mercy devotion, that it was simply a pious Polish devotion, which it is. However, Jesus meant it for all of us, for the whole church and for the whole world, not just for Polish Catholics, not just for Catholics, but for everyone, that this is a time for mercy. So John Paul was very strategic in that he waited until St. Faustina was officially a saint. He waited about 5 minutes. She was officially enrolled in the Canon of Saints. She was canonized April 30th, 2000. I happened to be there in St. Peter's Square when that happened. And in his homily, he said, from this Sunday forward, from this moment forward, the second Sunday of Easter shall be known as Divine Mercy Sunday, fulfilling Jesus' second command to have that happen. Now, I write this in my book, this new book as well, that he called that day the happiest day of his life. Now, he said it to an eminent cardiologist, Dr. Valentin Fuster, who is the president of Cedars-Sinai Cardiac Hospital in New York City, who was part of the team that analyzed the healing miracle for Faustina's canonization. He was there at the canonization. He's not even Catholic, but he and some of the other priests that I interviewed were at lunch with John Paul II, and the Pope took this cardiologist aside and had a conversation wherein he said, "This is the happiest day of my life." So I talked to Dr. Fuster a couple of months ago. He verified that information for me. And I said, "Did he say it to the whole group?" And he said, "No, he said it just to me." So why would that be the happiest day of his life? I can only speculate, though, that because he was able to fulfill that command of Christ to have the second Sunday of Easter declared Divine Mercy Sunday. And this whole devotion now kind of has an authenticness to it that is institutional in the church, which is so necessary for our time.
Yeah. Now, for people who might have heard the term Divine Mercy, but maybe it remains a little bit abstract, maybe they've heard Divine Mercy Sunday, they've seen some Divine Mercy images, where you have Jesus and you have the rays coming out of his heart that are blue and red. What really is the heart of the teaching of Divine Mercy that we need to receive?
Divine mercy is essentially God's heart poured out for us. I mean, the creation of the universe, of humanity, really is God's act of mercy. And everything that God does is mercy because God is full in himself. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't need us. But his love is so great that he wanted to share his love with us. And fallen humanity needs something more than what we have. We can't attain heaven on our own. We can only do that through Christ and his mercy. His mercy was shown fully on the cross. But what he said to Faustina is, this is a time for mercy, a time of extraordinary mercy, where even the most hardened sinner, Jesus said, has the greatest right to my mercy. So what God is saying is that he's ready. He's the prodigal father, ready to just embrace us, no matter how dirty and filthy we are from sin, that he's ready for us. I mean, all we have to do is turn our gaze to him and boom, like no other time in history, God is ready. But in the Revelation, there is also that there is coming a time for justice. So I always tell people, don't delay, because the time for mercy is now, but it's finite, it's ticking. But I also say that no matter whether your last breath or when Jesus comes again in glory, the first judgment is going to happen, and you got to receive that mercy before that time. So that's really the heart of Divine Mercy, is God is a merciful Father who loves us beyond what we can even comprehend. Our brains are so small, that our hearts are so small, we can't even understand how great God's mercy is.
Yeah, I love that image too, that she speaks about the sinner having a right to mercy, which of course is not, God's mercy is a sheer gift, and yet his gift is so real, that it almost creates that no matter how much we've sinned, we have that, it's already been given.
Yeah.
And it is interesting that there's something about our age. And I think, John Paul II was really aware of this, that, our age is not just an age of sin or confusion, of which there have been many, but it's also like an age kind of a post-Christian world or culture where Christianity has been, I think it was Chesterton who said, Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting, it's been found difficult and therefore left untried. But the general attitude is that, Christianity already had its chance and it didn't work.
Yeah.
So there's nothing new there. There's nothing worth really considering, and which puts us in a way at a stage worse off than the pagans who hadn't yet encountered Christianity, because it's harder to encounter the truth about God's mercy if you think you already understand it.
Yeah, yeah. I think if people really delve into Mother Teresa and see her work and understand her work, they're drawn to it like a magnet. And she's, so for example, by the time she died, she had attracted over 400,000 people to join in her work as missionaries of charity, brothers, sisters, and priests, to do the worst possible work for free all over the world. And why would they want to do that? Why would they want to, attend to people who are dying and picking up lepers off the street and caring for people who really didn't care to be cared for even? But but it was because they were compelled by mercy, by this extraordinary act of mercy. Some of the stories that particularly in Jim Tuohy's book, To Love and Be Loved, really moved me. That her heart for these people is just extraordinary.
Could you give you?
Yeah. There was one. There was one story in particular where she and her sisters picked up this person off the street who had been just left there for days, and when they picked him up, his skin came off. They brought him to the home for the dying, and Mother Teresa talked about this story too a couple of times, where the man said, "I lived on the street like an animal, but I die like an angel." They gave a dignified end to these human beings that had been discarded. And, you hear stories like that, and no matter how hard your heart is, you must be moved, because that is just, John Paul II called Mother the embodiment of the Good Samaritan. And she truly was. And that extraordinary mercy, acts of mercy, will draw people to Christianity. They'll want to know, what's that about? And I think Mother Teresa, she was criticized for not evangelizing. Like, did you baptize these people before they died? Why didn't you do that? Well, she said, that's not my call. That's not what Jesus asked me to do. Why don't you do it? And she would speak that way because she had her role and we have our role. She couldn't do everything, but there are things that collaboration that others could do, and that's she called them to that. And I think it's important to understand that we're all called to mercy. She had her way of showing mercy that was truly spectacular. We have our own ways of being merciful, even in our families. She also said that if you want to change the world, go home and love your family, and that is, I think, one of the most beautiful quotes that we can all relate to. Some of the most challenging people to love are the people in our own family, our spouse and our children, because we know them so well, and we get frustrated when things don't go the way we want them to go. But it's an opportunity to grow in holiness and to show even undeserved mercy.
Yeah, Mother Teresa, I think, would say that what you can do, I cannot do, and what I can do, you cannot do, but together we can do something beautiful for God.
Indeed.
And she would also speak about the five-fingered gospel, referring to Jesus's image of, from Matthew 25, but you did it to me. You did it to me.
Yeah.
And that's that. It's just, there it is. And it seems to me, and I think, you quote as well, one of the things she says where, I think it was this in the greatest disease in the West today is not tuberculosis or leprosy. It is being unwanted, unloved, uncared for. We can cure physical diseases with medicine, but the only cure for loneliness, despair, and hopelessness is love. There are many people dying for a little piece of bread, but far more dying for a little love. The poverty of the West is a different kind of poverty. It is not only a poverty of loneliness, but a spirituality. There's a hunger for love as there is a hunger for God.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think today she would be talking about the devices we carry in our pockets. Father Mike calls them the magic rectangle, right? That how it connects us, yes, virtually, but it separates us actually. So I think she and John Paul II would be talking about how these devices are exacerbating the problem of loneliness. We all know that teen suicide is epidemic in our country, and it's driven by this technology, in a sense, that it separates us from human connection, human interaction that is so necessary for how we're wired as human beings. John Paul talked about, knowing who we are as man. What is man? And I think we've lost some of that, even in the 20 years since he died, that we need to reconnect with other people. How I always tell I travel with my kids whenever I can, when I take trips, when I go speaking. And on my off time while I'm traveling, I reconnect with people. I have lunch and dinner with friends and colleagues all over the country simply because that human connection is so necessary. And I want to show that to my kids that, yeah, you can have friends on Facebook, but well, what if you actually met one, right? You really have a connection with virtually, but then you see their face and you hear their voice and you interact with them. It just there's a bond that is beyond the technology that we need to reestablish, I think.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that we have this. There's a tendency to look at the work Mother Teresa did and think it's too hard, or the work that. And undoubtedly, it is for many people. I mean, this is why not everyone's called to care for the poorest of the poor. Mm-hmm. But that it's not even like attractive, or that the dedication to God's mercy is too hard because it also calls for me to change. But I think we have this. We kind of forget sometimes just how hard it is to follow. Like if we don't follow the message of the gospel, we follow the message of the world. And the message of the world is also really hard.
Yes.
It's really unclear. Compete for money, compete for attention, control illness, or control safety, mm-hmm. right? We end up with, we end up either with focusing on things that we really can't control, that are outside of our ability to to overcome. Father Lamb, one of my mentors, would often say that, despite all of our efforts over the last few hundred years to get rid of, sin and disease, hospitals and prisons remain quite filled.
Yes, they do.
And so, and yet you also then get this idea of the, that we become, somebody described the modern world as we have more efficient means to less worthy ends.
Right.
We have incredible technology and we have no purpose to use it.
Reminds me of Pope Benedict saying that we weren't made for comfort, we were made for greatness. Yeah. What is greatness? Greatness is holiness. Greatness is being merciful and knowing the Lord and having just this desire to grow in holiness. That's greatness, because mm-hmm. that's what changes the world. You're going back to John Paul II and Mother Teresa. They literally did change the world. I say in my book that they bent history toward Jesus Christ. And isn't that our call? I mean, we're all called in our own way, in our own milieu, as it were to bend history toward Jesus Christ, toward holiness. And they're templates, they're models for that in a greater way, perhaps. But it's still, that's the call for each of us.
Yeah. We're coming up on our break, but when we come back, I'd love you to walk us through a little bit about the role of suffering in their lives. Both of them as young people. Mother Teresa lost her father at a young age. John Paul II lost his mother, then his older brother had already lost, and then soon after everything, lost his father, right? So just the role of suffering, the role of the suffering of their countries, and somehow how, having gone through that crucible of suffering as you describe it, they somehow become beacons of hope. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love to talk about that when we come back.
Okay, beautiful.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
I really wanted to dive into this question of suffering.
Yeah.
And you write about it in the book. I think some people might have, older people might remember at least a little bit of John Paul II having Parkinson's at the end of his life. But maybe could you just walk us a little bit through each of their sufferings, and then maybe a little bit of how that somehow contributes to this great, message of hope.
Yeah. So start with John Paul II, born in 1920 in South Central Poland. His father was a military man. His mother, I think she made lace or something, but her health was not good. Interestingly, her doctor advised her to have an abortion in 1920 when they conceived him, because her health was not good. But she, of course, refused and moved forward with the pregnancy and was just fine. Interestingly, how that happens today as well. Misdiagnosis of many things. Yeah. John Paul II's mother died when he was 8, almost 9 years old. He had an older brother who was a doctor. He idolized this young man. He was 25. I think John Paul was maybe 12 when his brother died, and he kept his brother's stethoscope beside his bedside and a picture of his parents through his whole pontificate until his own death, as memories of his family. So his brother died, then he's left with his father. They left Wadowice when he was 18, moved to Krakow, where he started at the Jagiellonian University. And a year later, Nazi tanks roll into Poland. Not even a couple of years after that, his father died suddenly, leaving him in his early 20s as essentially an orphan. And he said, "Everyone that I loved is dead." But it spurred in him. He said his father was his first seminary as well. His father's prayer life was very intense, and that was kind of his role model. And for all dads, I mean, your kids need to see you pray. I mean, look what happened when Karol Wojtyła Sr. prayed and his young son saw him pray. I mean, that is vital that our children see us pray, that we lead them in prayer. Because God could do amazing things with that, and certainly did with John Paul II. So he's left alone. And he worked in a rock quarry during the Nazi occupation. He was struck by a truck and was in the hospital for, I think, 2 months, recuperating from that. He still suffered effects from that for his whole life. Then went on, of course, to the pontificate. He was shot in 1981, and the effects of that lingered his entire life. Had Parkinson's toward the end, but a lot of suffering. You know, people think, oh, the Pope, he lives in a palace, he's got everything he needs, but but he embraced his suffering, and he knew that suffering was redemptive. He wrote about that extensively, and lived out his pontificate in publicly, his suffering publicly. His mind was sharp to the end, but his body failed, and he died in April of 2005.
Yeah. There was you describe in the book a little bit of when he was in the hospital after being shot in 1981. He had a visitor.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah. So there were a couple of things in doing my research that really stood out to me. And I really had to dig pretty hard to find, first of all, the first time that they met. There's very little about that. And then this visit in the hospital. But I found a news article published in Rome, and a newsletter published by the Missionaries of Charity, both confirming that 3 days after he was shot, when he was recovering after surgery, the Prime Minister of Italy visited and Mother Teresa visited. And another account says that she pinned a miraculous medal on him, and I've no doubt prayed with him, and thank God for his survival. But that emphasized the closeness. She was already in Rome, and I'm sure that her first reaction was to go right to the tabernacle and implore God to spare his life.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that the kind of God's providence was such that she was able to be there.
Yeah, no question.
That is side, and that was then all the more reason why she was so happy to see him in 1986.
Indeed,
so
indeed.
That's great. And so now Mother Teresa as well, though, right? Suffered a lot. Both of them, by the way, are from so Poland and Albania. They both end up under the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, both Slavic countries too, by the way.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about Mother Teresa's suffering.
Yeah, so she was born in 1910 in now modern day Macedonia, then Albania. She her father was murdered, poisoned. He was an Albanian nationalist. He was looking for unification of the countries, and people didn't like his politics, so they just slipped some poison, and he suffered for 3-4 days and died. I think she was 9. Yeah. She was very young, and they had a relatively well-to-do family. They did well, but that really, in a sense, crippled economically their family. Her mother was a woman of great faith. She had a sister and a brother, and she was the youngest child. When she was young, she read stories of missionaries in India. She was captivated by that, felt the call to become a nun, joined the Loretto sisters, left her mother when she was 18 years old, and went to Ireland, to Dublin, to train as a nun, to learn English. And she never saw her mother again or her sister. And I think that was a great pain for her.
Because they were behind the Iron Curtain in Albania.
Right. Later in life.
They couldn't actually, even though she was famous,
right.
It didn't matter.
Yeah.
There was no way to have an in-person visit.
Yeah, but her mother said, go and don't look back. And so she,
wow.
and you have to think about travel in those days. So she left in 1908. She was born in 1910. She left in 1928, went to Dublin. Yep. In 1929, she arrives in Calcutta. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was no air transportation. There was no airplanes that flew across countries. It was all by train and ground transportation, and even communication in those days. I mean, getting a letter from Calcutta to Albania was a feat. So the communication wasn't great. And then, of course, the Second World War happened, and the Iron Curtain descended on her native land, and she was unable to go back. Later in her life, she was able to visit their graves, and I think she reunited with her brother in Italy and some of her nieces and nephews.
Yeah, I think there was a story of her brother when he was maybe like 20, I don't remember, early 20s. He was going to become in the army, I believe. Mm-hmm. And he told the story about how that he was going to be in charge of men and groups of men. And she said something like, well, her husband was in charge of many more.
I love it.
So Jesus Christ, right, being king of the universe. And so no, it really is. But yeah, and then Mother Teresa also experienced, of course, first the call to join the Sisters of Loretto, mm-hmm. And then after teaching for about 20 years, received a call within the call, and Jesus kind of disturbed her life. She was a happy, effective,
she was a teacher.
Yeah, within a convent, and having, Indian young women who were capable of family were capable of sending them to the school and giving herself to that life. But then she heard the voice. She saw kind of Jesus calling her on the cross to have a call within the call, and I thirst.
To do something different.
Right.
Yeah.
And so after that great vision of Jesus and this intense spousal presence of Jesus Christ, right, then she has decades of
dryness,
this dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
So could you walk us through that a little bit, especially maybe people who aren't familiar?
Yeah. So she, I mentioned she arrived in Calcutta in 1929, 1946, she gets this call within a call to leave the Loretto sisters and to minister to the sick and dying, specifically to them. The Loretto sisters wore a black habit. They were teachers. This was a very different thing. And she chose a habit that was similar to what poor people wore in India. So she would blend in and not stand out. Began ministering in 1948, and her order is approved by the Archdiocese of Calcutta in 1950. She spent 3 years by herself doing this work, and until some of her former students started joining her. Going back to her suffering, she had much suffering, and she refused a lot of medical treatment as well. She did have some heart attacks. She had very difficulty with her feet, but she chose to wear the clothing of the poor. So she wore discarded shoes. People offered her orthopedic soles and all that. She refused. Like, this is my call. My call is to be like the poor, to eat like the poor, to live like the poor. So she had no luxuries at all. She did fly in airplanes, though, because people paid for her flights and took good care of her while she was traveling. But she lived poor on purpose, and she didn't have to. She embraced that suffering.
Yeah. We actually had a conference on Mother Teresa about 10 years ago. I think it was like 2013, called Mother Teresa and the Mystics, Renewal of Spiritual Theology. The book's actually published with Sapientia Press, and you can get it at the CUA website. But we had Father Brian Kolota-Haychek, who was the postulator,
yeah,
and pulled together the cause for Mother Teresa's canonization. And one of the things he said that always really struck me was that because she saw the poverty of the poorest of the poor, she took on that poverty herself.
Yeah.
But as we've already seen, she said the greatest poverty is to be unwanted and to be unloved.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow she not only had the physical poverty, but she even experienced emotionally the lack of consolation of her bridegroom.
Yes.
So which she could see as a way of sharing in the very poverty of kind of modern man who feels
disconnected,
lonely and disconnected
from each other and from God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all the while, no one knew.
Yeah.
Because she smiled.
Yep.
Right? And she worked and she acted. And I think it's a beautiful witness to this kind of, heroism.
Her critics called her a fraud. Like, you're pretending like you know Jesus. You're pretending like you love him and he loves you, but he's distant and you're putting on a show.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a show. She had such deep conviction. Early in my journey as a Catholic, I had some profound experiences of Christ. And I know that was real and that transformed me. Yeah. So I tell the Lord all the time, I don't need to feel that again. I felt it, and it's like nuclear energy that's just carrying me through the rest of my life. And of course, Eucharistic adoration and the sacraments are our fuel, and that was her fuel too. Yeah. She knew that the call was real. She knew that Jesus was real, and it pained her greatly. She only shared this with her spiritual directors and no one else. And those closest to her were shocked after her death when this was revealed.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's just a great beauty in that sense of, it's as simple as, faith is not a feeling. It's a
decision.
It's a decision to recognize a truth that God has revealed. And I think it was even C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity says that, faith is the art of holding on to truths once delivered by reason in spite of our changing moods, for moods will change. And
love it. This
idea too that, marriage, right? You know what I mean? The honeymoon, you know what I mean? It's like being married when I'm, the blessing of watching my parents almost have 61 years of anniversary,
wow.
That's a long marriage. And it's like their feelings, of course, change, but it's their decisions and their actions that shape their feelings and their experiences. And I think there's something really beautiful about Mother Teresa's, witness that both of them, John Paul II, we sometimes think, John Paul II, won the battle against, against the, Soviet Union with his visits in 79 to Poland and, 11 years later, or in 89 and 90, the wall falls. And so, but there's a deep sense in which, no, that's not why he was hopeful. Because he was hopeful during when his beloved Poland fell to the Nazis and then fell to the Soviets. And then he was just as concerned about the West having escaped Nazism and communism falling to doctrinal, basically moral relativism.
Yes.
Which he kind of saw just as big of a problem.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah, no question.
Yeah. So I think, you mentioned when he in 1978 is elected, I love his quote you give. It's one I've used it in some of my talks, but he says, in his inauguration homily, he said, "Brothers and sisters, do not be afraid." I think it was one of his favorite things. "Do not be afraid to welcome Christ and accept his power. Help the Pope and all those who wish to serve Christ. And with Christ's power to serve the human person and the whole of mankind, do not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ. To his saving power, open the boundaries of states, economic, political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, development. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it."
Love it.
So how could you kind of like maybe just, kind of summarize a little bit about what does this mean for John Paul II's legacy? Don't be afraid. And that's his, message to us and kind of also echoed and reinforced by, Mother Teresa. We seem to have an age that's profoundly, that was in 78,
yes,
right? Now in, 2025, we're having an era that's profoundly anxious, kind of depressed, resentful, not, in a lot of emotional distress. So what would be something you would what would be something you'd want to like close with on John Paul II and Mother Teresa's wisdom not to be afraid?
Yeah, I think God wants nothing more than human flourishing, right? And what is human flourishing? Happy. I really believe it starts with happy families, with happy, holy mother and a father who love each other, who love their children, who love the Lord and his church, right? And human flourishing occurs when we are living right ordered lives, with love for each other, love for the Lord. And I think that's what John Paul is saying here, is that culture will flourish, society will flourish, countries will flourish, humanity will flourish if we are right ordered, recognizing the human person for what it is, created in God's image and likeness, and respecting that and loving that. So when we push Christ out of our lives individually or as a family or as a community or as a culture, as a nation, then human flourishing cannot occur, because that's not how God created things. That's not how he created us. We can't flourish as a human being when we push God off the throne. And I think one of the biggest problems in our culture, in the church, outside the church, is that we're saying either I don't recognize God, or I recognize God, but I got this. And no, we don't got this. He's got this. And we can only get this if we put him first, right? And have a relationship with the Lord in a way that he created us to have one. So and I think maybe for some people, that's the fear, that if I let God in, then I have to change. And that's hard. That is hard. And I know it's hard because I had to do it myself. And I continue to try to do it myself every day. So I think that's the fear for a lot of people, that we like control. We like to be in control of our lives, of our families' lives, of whatever sphere of influence we have. So, and I think both of these saints achieved what they did, were who they were, because they got out of the way. I love to quote John the Baptist, who said, "I must decrease, he must increase." And he must, just transform me to a point where people see Christ when they see me. And that's not easy, but it only requires humility. And I think that's the great virtue that both of these saints show us, is that humility is the necessary virtue.
Yeah. And I think also a part of that is that it's simply an illusion that we can control.
Yes, certainly.
The world around us. Even the Stoics, I don't want to say even, but the Stoics, no connection with Christ, but they recognized that you couldn't control your health. You can't control your, who stays alive and who, you can't keep people alive. You can't control the outcomes of politics. The only thing you really control is your response to it. But we're so caught up in that. And what Christ says is, not only do you only have control over how you respond, but he says ultimately, wait a second, I'm going to bring this about. I'm going to bring about a renewal in the resurrection, right? That where I am, there you may also be. I am now with the Father, you will come with me. And I love this last line from where he says, "Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it." And so it's kind of that idea, Christ knows what's in us, which means in a way, Christ knows all of us.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the Catechism 6:15 that says, on the cross, Christ knew and loved all of us. Mm-hmm. And I think we can think of that all as he loved each human being.
Ever created.
But he also loves all of us. He knew and loved all of us, which means he knows my failings more than I do.
Indeed.
And yet still loves me. That mercy, right? Mercy is given to the unworthy to make them worthy. And so this sense in which Christ knows what is in man, he alone knows it. I think it's really, it's freeing. And I think John Paul II and Mother Teresa, in a way, their suffering kind of forced them to embrace the reality that they could not control the world. Human providence is limited. Doesn't mean we can't do things. Obviously, we should, try to do things to, take care of our external circumstances the best we can. But ultimately, right, it's simply above our pay grade to keep our loved ones alive, right? And so it's in a way through our suffering that we can open ourselves up more to the mystery of divine providence. And I think maybe just one last point is that the sense of recovering divine mercy is really trusting that not just God is merciful, but that God is acting out his mercy right now. And that if I surrender and put myself into God's hands, I love a prayer that, sometimes when my, loved ones and family members have been struggling, I will say, Lord, before they were mine, they were yours, and I put them in your hands. And I trust that everything is happening just as it's meant to, and that God will bring good out of it if we love him and let him. So I think this recovery of God's providence is kind of witnessed in both of them.
I agree.
That's great. Well, I do want to ask you, you've been on the show before, so I want to ask you all the questions, but I do want to ask you a little bit. What's a book you've been reading?
Recently, To Sanctify the World by George Weigel. His premise is that the promise of Vatican II has not yet been fulfilled. And I love the part that John Paul II played in it through his 26-year pontificate. If you look at his writings, virtually everything he wrote that was footnoted, annotated, referred back to the council. Yeah. He unpacked the council. Interestingly, when I was the editor of Legatus magazine, we interviewed George Weigel about Vatican II, and he said that we need to know that the church, that the council is a council in continuity with the church's teaching and not a rupture from it. Yeah. I quote that in both of my books, as a matter of fact, simply because it's important to know that fact. And his book is unpacking that.
Yeah, and George Weigel also has the great book, Witness to Hope, which is a wonderful
the ultimate biography of John Paul II.
Yeah, and I think that's a great. It's huge. It's a big book, but it's good. And so and Mother Teresa also has a book. If people are interested, you can get the Mother Teresa Come Be My Life by Brian Kolota-Haychek. And of course, by the way, if you want a book on both Mother Teresa and John Paul II, right? We have
Yet Untitled. May end up calling it Icons. I'm not sure yet. Icons. Really, what I think I'm looking at a subtitle of how Mother Teresa and John Paul II changed the 21st century and gave 20th century and gave hope to the 21st century, or to give hope in our day.
Well, I love the message of hope. That's beautiful. And there's a great this is a year of the Jubilee. Which John Paul II declared a Jubilee in 2000, and Pope Francis has declared one in 2025.
Yes.
And I don't remember I don't know if it's an encyclical or not, but the letter that Pope Francis wrote was called, from Romans 5:5, hope does not disappoint. And so this message of mercy, of the Jubilee, the freedom from sin, freedom from death, all of these promises are given to us in the message of hope. So I love that you've picked hope as the kind of as the focus of helping us to recover. Obviously, the saints, of course, are present. They're alive. They're a cloud of witnesses that surround us. So we can go to John Paul II and Mother Teresa as our beloved intercessors.
Yeah.
So for people who want to learn more about you and your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, find me at booksbypatrick.com.
Okay.
It is patricknovecosky.com, but that's hard to spell. So booksbypatrick.com. My PR work, you can find out more about that at catholicpublicist.com.
Okay, and listeners or viewers may enjoy a former episode with Patrick Novecosky on, I think, the Pope who changed the world.
That's it.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.